The arrogant salesperson laughed at the black customer who wanted to see the most expensive car in the dealership. But soon he was ashamed. Marco pulled into the dealership parking lot, his car rattling as he turned off the ignition. He sat for a moment, looking at the gleaming glass entrance. Today had to be different. He needed to secure a big sale. He couldn't afford to fall behind anymore. Marco straightened his tie, adjusted his coat, and stepped out, taking a deep breath. Inside, the dealership looked like it always did. Spotless floors, luxury cars positioned at precise angles, the smell of leather in the air. The receptionist gave him a polite nod, and Marco nodded back, forcing a smile. He walked over to his desk, placing his briefcase down and organizing the paperwork. His eyes flicked up to the clock. 8:40 m.m. sharp. He was ready. "Morning, Marco," called out Steve, one of his co-workers, as he passed by. "Morning," Marco replied, trying to sound casual. He had to be at his best today. His stomach twisted at the thought of his rent, the bills piling up. If he didn't land a big sale soon, eviction was just around the corner. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Mr. Thompson, the dealership manager, approached, his expression as stern as always. Marco tensed up, bracing himself. "Marco," Thompson said. His voice was low and demanding. "We need results today. You know what that means?" He paused, his eyes locking on Marco's. "No more excuses. You have one more shot. Got it?" Marco nodded. "Yes, sir." "Understood." Thompson didn't wait for more. He just turned and walked away, leaving Marco with a sinking feeling. The pressure felt like a weight pressing on his chest. Marco took a deep breath, shaking his head. He couldn't let fear take over. Not today. The morning dragged on, and customers began trickling in. Most of them were just looking, not buying. Marco approached each one, putting on his most convincing smile, but nothing was clicking. He could see the looks on his co-workers' faces, the whispers as they watched him strike out again and again. His confidence was dwindling, his desperation mounting. It was almost noon when Marco saw her walk in, a black woman, elegantly dressed, her posture exuding confidence. She moved with purpose, her gaze scanning the cars with an air of authority. Marco straightened up, smoothing his tie, and approached her. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to the dealership." Marco greeted her, offering a smile. "How can I assist you today?" The woman glanced at him, her expression neutral. She gave a small nod. "I'd like to see your premium models, the best you have." Marco's smile widened. This was it. He could feel it. This was his chance for a big sale. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, leading her to the section where the top models were displayed. He moved confidently, trying to gauge her interest. "This one here is our latest luxury SUV," Marco said, gesturing towards a polished black vehicle. "It comes fully equipped with all the advanced features, top-notch safety, custom interiors, everything you'd want." The woman listened, her gaze moving over the car. She didn't say much, her expression giving nothing away. Marco felt a flicker of uncertainty. She wasn't reacting the way most customers did. He couldn't tell if she was impressed or uninterested. He kept going, hoping to find a way to connect. As Marco continued, the woman's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then slipped it back into her pocket. She looked at Marco, her tone calm. "My son will be joining us shortly. He's on his way." "Of course," Marco said, keeping his voice steady, though something about the situation made him uneasy. He couldn't place it, but there was a sense of discomfort growing in his gut. He ignored it, focusing instead on maintaining his professional demeanor. A few minutes later, the door to the dealership opened again. Marco turned, expecting to see another customer, but his heart sank as soon as he saw the young man walking towards them. He recognized the face instantly. It was someone from his past, someone he had wronged. Marco's throat tightened, his mind racing. The young man, Daniel, met his eyes, and Marco could see the flash of recognition, followed by something else: resentment. Marco swallowed, trying to keep his composure. "Hey, Mom," Daniel said, his voice casual, but his eyes still locked on Marco. He walked up to his mother, his posture tense. The woman smiled at her son, then looked at Marco. "This is my son, Daniel," she introduced. Marco forced a smile, his voice tight. "Nice to meet you, Daniel." Daniel's gaze didn't soften. He stared at Marco for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, we've met before." Marco felt his chest tighten. He tried to keep his voice neutral. "I think I remember. It's been a while." The tension was thick, and Marco could feel the situation slipping out of his control. He had to find a way to steer things back, to keep his chance at the sale. But the way Daniel was looking at him, it was clear that this wasn't just going to go away. The woman sensed something off, her brows knitting together. "Is there something I should know?" she asked, her voice sharp. Marco swallowed, trying to steady himself. He needed to handle this delicately. But looking at Daniel, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. His past had caught up to him, and now it was staring him right in the face, demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. Marco swallowed his nerves, putting on his best sales smile. The woman was still examining the car, her hands brushing over the polished exterior. Marco stepped closer, trying to regain his confidence. "Would you like to hear more about the features?" he asked, keeping his voice upbeat. The woman nodded, though she still seemed detached. Marco began his usual pitch, highlighting the premium leather seats, the advanced safety technology, and the sleek design. He tried to sound enthusiastic, but the woman's calm demeanor made it hard. She seemed indifferent to everything he said. She glanced at him, her gaze direct. "I've seen a lot of cars. What makes this one special?" Marco hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say. He could feel his confidence slipping. Before he could answer, she looked at her phone again, her expression softening. "My son's almost here," she said. "We'll wait for him before deciding on a test drive." "Of course," Marco replied, trying to hide the unease that settled in his stomach. He had no idea why, but something about waiting for the son was making him anxious. It wasn't long before the doors of the dealership opened, and Daniel walked in. Marco's breath caught in his chest. He forced himself to stay calm, but he could feel the tension immediately. Daniel looked at him, his eyes hard, his expression unfriendly. "Hey, Mom," Daniel said, walking up to them. He gave Marco a quick, cold glance, then turned back to his mother. "Sorry, I'm late." The woman smiled at her son, then gestured toward Marco. "This is Marco. He's showing us the car." "Yeah, we've met," Daniel said, his tone flat. Marco forced a smile, nodding. "Good to see you again, Daniel." Daniel didn't bother to respond. Instead, he looked at the car, his expression giving nothing away. Marco could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find a way to keep things moving smoothly, but with Daniel here, everything felt wrong. "So," Marco said, trying to regain control of the conversation, "what do you think of the SUV? It's got some great features, perfect for a family." Daniel looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't say anything at first, and Marco felt the silence stretch out uncomfortably. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm but with an edge. "I think it's fine, but I'm more interested in the person selling it." The woman glanced at her son, a puzzled look crossing her face. "What do you mean?" she asked. Daniel kept his eyes on Marco, his stare unrelenting. "Mom, this guy used to work security at my high school. He wasn't exactly friendly." Marco's stomach dropped. He felt his mouth go dry. He had hoped Daniel wouldn't bring it up, that maybe they could just get through this without any mention of the past. But here it was, laid out in front of them. The woman turned to Marco, her expression serious. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice steady. Marco swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I did work at a high school for a while," he said, trying to keep his voice even. I wasn't in a great place back then." Daniel scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's putting it lightly. You treated people like garbage. You made my life hell." The woman's eyes widened, and she looked at Marco with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Is that true?" she asked again, her voice colder this time. Marco felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I wasn't proud of how I acted back then," he admitted. "I was dealing with a lot of things. But that's no excuse. I know I hurt people, and I'm sorry for that." Daniel shook his head, his expression filled with disdain. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Marco. You can't just treat people like trash and then apologize when it's convenient." Marco felt a pang of guilt, his chest tightening. He looked at the woman, who was watching him, her face unreadable. He needed to do something, anything, to salvage the situation. "Look," Marco said, his voice trembling slightly, "I know I can't change the past. I made mistakes. But I've changed. I'm trying to be better. I'm not that person anymore." The woman looked at her son, then back at Marco. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice cold. "You've hurt my son. Why should I believe anything you say now?" Marco felt his heart sink. He knew he was losing them. He could see the sale slipping away, along with any chance at redemption. He looked at Daniel, his expression pleading. "Daniel, I'm truly sorry," Marco said. "I know I hurt you, and I know an apology isn't enough. But I want to prove that I've changed. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Daniel stared at him for a long moment, his eyes hard. He finally looked at his mother, then sighed heavily. "I don't know, Mom. Maybe we should just go." The woman nodded slowly, her expression still cold. She turned to Marco. "I think we're done here." Marco's heart sank, and he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He couldn't lose this chance, not just for the sale, but to prove he had changed. He stepped forward, his voice desperate. "Please," Marco said, "just give me a chance. I know I messed up, but I'm trying to be better. Let me prove it to you." The woman looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She seemed to consider for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think so," she said, her voice firm. She turned to leave, and Daniel followed her. Marco stood there, watching them walk away, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. He knew he had lost not only the sale, but also any chance to prove himself. He felt defeated, his heart heavy as he watched them disappear through the dealership doors. Marco forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He needed to stay focused. He had to act like everything was normal, even if he could feel the tension thickening around them. He turned back towards the SUV, giving his practiced smile, although it felt weak. "Let me show you some of the other features inside," Marco said, gesturing to the driver's side door. He opened it, holding it for the woman. She stepped in, her face still skeptical, while Daniel lingered outside, his arms crossed. Marco turned to Daniel, trying to meet his eyes. "Would you like to check out the back seat?" he asked, attempting to keep his tone light. Daniel stared at him for a moment before stepping around the car and getting in the back, not saying a word. Marco swallowed hard, the silence between them deafening. He moved to the passenger seat and climbed in, adjusting his position to face them. "So," Marco began, his voice trembling just slightly. "As I mentioned earlier, this SUV is equipped with some of the top safety features. It's got adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assist." He trailed off, noticing that neither the mother nor Daniel seemed to be paying attention. They were both looking at Marco, waiting. "Is something wrong?" Marco asked, his voice faltering. The mother glanced in the rearview mirror at her son. "What happened between the two of you?" she asked directly, her voice demanding an answer. Daniel's expression hardened. He leaned forward slightly. "You remember, don't you?" he said, his voice quiet but filled with anger. "You were the guy at my school. You thought it was okay to throw your weight around, to treat us like we were nothing." Marco's face paled. He gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning white. The memories came rushing back, his time working security at that high school, the anger and bitterness he carried with him every day, the way he used his position to make himself feel powerful by making others feel small. The mother turned, her eyes narrowing. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice cold. Marco opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had to say something. He had to explain. I wasn't in a good place back then," he stammered. "I made mistakes. I know that. And I'm truly sorry." Daniel scoffed from the back seat. "Sorry? That's it." He shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. "You made my life miserable. And now you think you can just say, sorry." The mother's face hardened, and she shook her head, her eyes filled with disappointment. "This isn't just about a sale, Marco," she said. "This is about trust. And right now, I don't trust you. You hurt my son." Marco felt his throat tighten. He looked at Daniel, then back at the mother. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I hurt people, and I regret it every day. I've changed. I'm trying to be a better person now." Daniel stared at him, his eyes full of anger. "People like you don't change," he said. "You just learn how to hide it better." Marco's heart sank. He knew he had lost them. The sale, the chance to prove himself. It was all slipping away. He could feel panic setting in, his chest tightening. He needed to do something, anything, to make them see that he was serious. The mother shook her head, her expression cold. "I think we're done here," she said. Marco's mind raced. He had to find a way to turn this around. He couldn't lose this opportunity. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Please, just give me one more chance. I want to make this right." The mother looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "How?" she demanded. "How do you plan to make this right? You can't undo what you did." Marco nodded, his eyes downcast. "I know I can't," he said softly. "But I can do better. I can be better. I don't expect you to just forgive me, but I want to prove that I've changed. I'll do whatever it takes." There was a long silence in the car, the tension almost unbearable. Marco could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He looked at Daniel, his eyes pleading. Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. He seemed to consider for a long moment before finally speaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice low. "But maybe I can give you a chance to prove it." The mother looked at her son, then back at Marco. She sighed heavily, her expression softening just a fraction. "All right," she said, "but this is your last chance, Marco. And don't think for a second that we trust you yet." Marco nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and fear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise I won't let you down." They all climbed out of the car, the atmosphere still tense, but with a small glimmer of hope. Marco knew he had a long way to go. He knew he would have to prove himself, not just today, but every day moving forward. And he was willing to do that, whatever it took. As they walked back to the main showroom, Marco felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't over. He still had a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Marco stood by his desk, watching as Daniel and his mother walked away. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He had managed to buy himself a chance, but now it was time to show them he truly meant it. Words weren't going to be enough. He needed to act differently, to prove, through his behavior, that he was a different person. He sat down at his desk, his hands resting on the keyboard, unmoving. His mind was spinning. He had spent so many years ignoring the harm he'd caused, dismissing the pain of others as insignificant. But now, face to face with someone he had hurt, Marco felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He looked around the dealership. It was busy. Customers chatting with salespeople, admiring the cars, paperwork being filled out. Marco knew he had to make the most of today, to show not just Daniel and his mother, but also his colleagues that he could change. Later that afternoon, Marco saw the mother and son approaching again, slowly walking back towards him. He stood up, adjusting his tie, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his moment. He needed to get this right. "Thank you for coming back," Marco said, his voice steady as they approached his desk. "I appreciate the chance." The mother looked at Marco, her face still stern, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "We're here because Daniel thinks you deserve a chance," she said, her voice measured. "Don't waste it." Marco nodded, his eyes sincere. "I won't," he promised. He gestured towards a seating area nearby. "Please, have a seat. I'll get us started on the paperwork if you're ready, but I also understand if you want to take more time." Daniel and his mother exchanged a look before they both sat down. Marco could feel the tension still hanging in the air, but he could also feel the smallest sense of hope. He knew he had a lot to prove, and this was his chance to start. As Marco sat down across from them, he leaned forward slightly, meeting their eyes. "I want to be clear," he said. "This isn't just about selling a car. I know what I did back then was wrong, and I want to earn your trust, not just for this sale, but moving forward." The mother studied him, her eyes narrowing. "How do you plan to earn our trust?" she asked, her voice firm. "Words are cheap, Marco." Marco swallowed, nodding. He knew she was right. "I agree," he said. "I'm not expecting you to trust me right away. But I want to take steps, starting here and now, to prove I've changed. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Daniel was quiet, watching Marco with wary eyes. "You hurt a lot of people," he said finally, his voice low. "You made me feel like I was worthless. You can't undo that." Marco nodded, feeling the sting of those words. He looked directly at Daniel. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry. I know that doesn't erase what I did. But I want you to know that I truly regret the way I treated you. I was wrong." There was a long pause, and then the mother leaned back, crossing her arms. "We'll see," she said. "Actions speak louder than words." Marco nodded again, feeling the weight of the challenge in her words. He took out the necessary paperwork for the SUV, laying it out in front of them. "Let's take this step by step," he said, keeping his voice steady. They went through the details slowly, and Marco took his time explaining each aspect of the process. He could feel Daniel and his mother watching him closely, their expressions guarded. Marco knew they were testing him, waiting to see if he would slip back into his old ways, if he would become impatient or dismissive. But he remained calm, answering their questions patiently. Halfway through the paperwork, the mother paused, looking up at Marco. "Why now?" she asked. "Why did you decide to change?" Marco took a deep breath, considering her question. "I think it's because I finally saw what I had become," he said. "I was angry and bitter, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it. I realized that if I didn't change, I'd end up losing everything: my job, my respect, my sense of self-worth. I don't want to be that person anymore." The mother watched him for a long moment, then nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We'll see," she repeated, but her tone was less harsh this time. Daniel looked at Marco, his gaze still skeptical but with a hint of curiosity. "It's going to take more than just this," he said. "You know that, right?" Marco nodded. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready for it. I want to show you, day by day, that I'm different now." The rest of the process went smoothly, with Marco making sure to be transparent and thorough in everything he explained. By the end, they had gone through all the necessary steps, and the mother looked at Marco, her face serious. "I'm still not sure if I trust you," she said, "but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove it." Marco smiled, his heart swelling with relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means a lot to me." As they stood up, Marco extended his hand. The mother hesitated for a moment before shaking it, her grip firm. Daniel looked at Marco, his expression still cautious, and gave a small nod. "We'll be watching," Daniel said, his voice a warning but also an invitation. Marco nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said. They left the dealership, and Marco watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. He knew this was just the beginning. He still had a lot to prove, but he also knew that he had taken an important first step. Marco turned back to the dealership, his mind already focused on the work ahead. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. One day at a time, one action at a time. He wasn't just selling cars anymore. He was rebuilding trust, and that meant more to him than any sale ever could. Marco arrived at the dealership early the next morning. He parked his car, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before stepping out. He needed to prove, not just to Daniel and his mother, but to himself, that he had changed. He had to be better. Not just once, but consistently. As he walked into the showroom, he was determined. Today was the beginning of his journey. "Morning, Marco," Steve called, his tone curious. There was something in the way Steve looked at Marco, like he wasn't sure what to make of the new version of his coworker. "Morning, Steve," Marco replied, giving him a genuine nod. He made his way to his desk, organizing his things and getting ready for the day ahead. The first customers began arriving soon after, and Marco knew he needed to treat each one with the respect they deserved. A family of 3 walked into the showroom, parents with their young daughter. Marco approached them calmly, offering his assistance without any of his usual pressure tactics. "Welcome," Marco said warmly. "Can I help you find something today?" The father nodded, looking around. "We're just browsing. We need something safe, for the family." Marco nodded, giving them space to browse while staying close enough to answer any questions. He noticed Steve watching from across the showroom, a curious look on his face. Marco ignored it, focusing instead on the family. He listened to their concerns, answering each question with patience. He wanted to show that he was different now. By mid-morning, Marco had helped several customers. Each interaction was genuine. He took his time, listened, and didn't push for a sale. He could feel a shift in the way people responded to him, and it gave him hope. Around noon, Marco looked up and saw them, Daniel and his mother. They walked into the dealership, and Marco felt a mix of anxiety and determination rise in his chest. This was it, the moment to prove himself. He took a deep breath and approached them, his voice calm. "Good afternoon," Marco said. "It's nice to see you both again. How can I assist you today?" The mother looked at him, her expression still guarded. She glanced at her son, then back at Marco. "We're here to see if you meant what you said," she replied, her tone direct. "You said you've changed. We want to see it." Marco nodded. "Of course. Please, feel free to look around. I'm here if you need anything." They walked past him, and Marco stepped back, giving them space. He could feel their eyes on him as he helped another customer, a man looking for a work truck. Marco treated the man with patience, taking time to explain the features without rushing or pressuring. He noticed Daniel watching, observing every move. The man was difficult, questioning everything Marco said, challenging the prices and features. But Marco kept his composure. He answered calmly, never losing his temper, even when the man seemed to go out of his way to provoke him. Finally, the man nodded, satisfied, and thanked Marco before leaving. Marco turned and caught Daniel's eyes. There was something there, maybe respect, maybe just curiosity, but it was different. Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging Marco's effort. The mother approached Marco, her expression still serious. "You handled that well," she said. "Better than I expected." Marco nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Thank you. I'm trying to be better every day." They walked together to the SUV section, and Marco resumed explaining the car they had looked at the previous day. He went through the features again, but this time he was more personal, more open. He talked about the car's safety, how it was built for families, addressing their specific concerns rather than just giving a generic pitch. The mother listened, her expression softening slightly. She glanced at Daniel, who was still watching Marco closely, then back at Marco. "We've decided we might be interested," she said finally. "But this isn't just about the car, Marco. It's about you showing us that you're serious about changing." Marco nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand. And I want to prove it, not just with words, but with actions." As they went through the paperwork, Marco remained patient, explaining each step clearly, answering their questions thoroughly. He wanted them to feel comfortable, to know that this was about more than just making a sale. It was about building trust. The mother looked at Marco as they neared the end of the process. her eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been different today," she said. "But one good day doesn't mean you've changed for good." Marco nodded. "I know, and I'm ready to keep proving it, every day, for as long as it takes." Daniel, who had been quiet for most of the interaction, finally spoke. "It's not just about selling cars," he said, his voice low. "It's about how you treat people. You treated me like I was nothing back then." Marco looked at Daniel, his eyes sincere. "I know, and I'm truly sorry for that. I was wrong. I want to be better now, not just for you, but for everyone I interact with." The mother and son exchanged a look, then nodded. "We'll see, Marco," she said. "We'll be watching." As they completed the paperwork and finalized the deal, Marco felt a sense of accomplishment, but also the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about a sale, it was about redemption, about earning their trust day by day. After they left, Marco returned to his desk. He caught a glimpse of Mr. Thompson, who was watching from a distance. Thompson approached, his expression guarded. "Heard you made the sale," he said, his voice gruff. Marco nodded. "Yes, sir, I tried to do it the right way." Thompson studied Marco for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Keep it up. We'll see if it sticks." Marco nodded, his resolve unwavering. He had taken a step today, but he knew there was a long road ahead. Redemption wasn't earned in a single moment, it was earned through consistent actions, every day. He looked around the dealership, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just here to sell cars anymore. He was here to become a better person, to prove that change was possible, not just to Daniel and his mother, but to himself and everyone around him. Marco sat at his desk, staring at the blank computer screen in front of him. The dealership was quiet now, the bustle of the morning having slowed down. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in his chest after Daniel and his mother had left. The interaction had been tense, but there was also a glimmer of hope. They had given him a chance, a small one, and Marco knew he couldn't waste it. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind kept replaying Daniel's words, how Marco had made him feel worthless, how the hurt he caused didn't just disappear with an apology. Marco knew he couldn't change what he had done, but he was determined to prove, through his actions, that he was different now. As the day wore on, Marco noticed his co-workers watching him. Some of them looked curious, others skeptical. Steve, in particular, had been giving Marco sidelong glances all morning, as if trying to figure out what was going on. "Hey, Marco," Steve finally said, approaching Marco's desk. "What's up with you lately? You seem different." Marco looked up at Steve, offering a small smile. "Just trying to be better, you know," he replied. "Trying to do things right." Steve raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Better, huh? What's that supposed to mean?" Marco sighed, leaning forward. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Steve. I've treated people poorly, and it's time I start fixing that. I'm serious about changing." Steve nodded slowly, his expression still skeptical. "Well, I guess we'll see. People don't change overnight, Marco." "I know," Marco said quietly, "but I'm willing to work on it every day." Before Steve could say anything else, Mr. Thompson, the dealership manager, appeared, his face set in a frown. He motioned for Marco to follow him. "In my office, Marco," he said, his voice clipped. Marco felt his stomach drop. He nodded, standing up and following Thompson into the small office at the back of the dealership. Thompson closed the door behind them, turning to face Marco, his arms crossed. "What's going on with you?" Thompson demanded. "I've been getting reports that you've been acting different, and not necessarily in a good way." Marco took a deep breath. "I'm trying to change, Mr. Thompson," he said. "I know I've been too aggressive in the past, too focused on the sale. I want to treat people better, be more respectful." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Respectful? This is a luxury dealership, Marco. Our clients expect a certain level of service. They don't want to see a salesman who's unsure of himself, who's trying to play nice. They want confidence. They want results." Marco swallowed hard. He knew Thompson wouldn't understand, but he had to try. "I get that, sir. But I think there's a way to provide excellent service without treating people poorly. I want to be someone my clients can trust, not just someone who pushes them into a sale." Thompson stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're on thin ice, Marco. You've been one of my top salesmen. But if I see this new behavior affecting your numbers, you're out. Do you understand?" Marco nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir. I understand." Thompson waved a dismissive hand. "Get back to work. And remember, results matter." Marco left the office, his mind racing. He knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew he couldn't keep going the way he had been. He had to change, even if it meant risking his job. He returned to his desk, taking a deep breath as he sat down. He needed to stay focused, to keep moving forward. Later that evening, as the dealership was closing, Marco found himself alone on the showroom floor. The lights were dim, and the cars gleamed under the soft glow. He walked slowly among them, his mind drifting back to his past, to the way he had treated people, to the lessons he had learned from his father. His father had always taught him to be tough, to never show weakness, to take control no matter the cost. Marco had followed those lessons for years, using his authority to belittle others, to make himself feel powerful. But now, for the first time, Marco realized that real strength wasn't about control. It was about empathy, about understanding the impact of his actions on others. He stopped in front of the SUV that Daniel and his mother had looked at, running his hand along the smooth surface. He thought about Daniel's face, the hurt in his eyes, the way he had hesitated before giving Marco a chance. Marco knew he didn't deserve it, but he was grateful for it. He was determined to prove that he was worthy of that chance. The next morning, Marco arrived at the dealership early again. He parked his car, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before stepping out. Today was a new day, another opportunity to show that he could change. He walked into the showroom, greeting the cleaning staff with a genuine smile, taking the time to ask how they were. As the day went on, Marco approached each customer with patience and respect. He listened to their needs, answered their questions without rushing, and didn't push for a sale. He noticed his co-workers watching him, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. But Marco didn't let it bother him. He was focused on his goal, becoming a better person, one interaction at a time. By mid-afternoon, Marco felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was making progress. He was taking the first steps towards becoming the person he wanted to be. Not just a good salesman, but a good human being. He looked around the dealership, seeing his colleagues busy with their own customers. He knew that change wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them, to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult it got. Marco took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just doing this for Daniel or his mother. He was doing it for himself, to prove that he could be better, and he was willing to do whatever it took. Marco arrived at the dealership that morning with a sense of renewed determination. He had a clear focus: to treat everyone with respect and genuine courtesy. He wasn't just selling cars anymore. He was working on rebuilding himself, proving that he could be the person he claimed he wanted to be. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and walked into the showroom, nodding at the receptionist as he passed. "Morning, Marco," Steve called, giving Marco a curious glance. "Morning, Steve," Marco responded, his tone relaxed. He walked over to his desk, organizing his paperwork and preparing for the day ahead. Customers were already starting to arrive, and Marco was ready to make every interaction count. Around mid-morning, Marco was helping an older couple look at a mid-range sedan when he saw someone at the entrance. Daniel, alone. Marco's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was what he had hoped for: a chance to speak to Daniel directly, without the presence of his mother or the pressure of a sale. Marco finished up with the couple, giving them a brochure and wishing them a great day. Then he turned his attention to Daniel, who was now standing in the middle of the showroom, his eyes scanning the cars before landing on Marco. Marco approached him, his voice calm. "Hey, Daniel," he said, giving a small nod. "Good to see you again." Daniel crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure if I'd come back," he admitted, his tone guarded. Marco nodded, understanding. "I get that. I'm glad you did, though. I'd like a chance to talk, if you're willing." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Yeah, all right. Let's talk." Marco gestured towards a quieter corner of the dealership, away from the busy showroom floor. They walked over, and Marco motioned for Daniel to sit. Daniel sat down, his gaze never leaving Marco, who sat across from him. There was a tense silence for a moment before Marco spoke, his voice sincere. "I know I've said this before, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to explain." Daniel leaned back, his expression still wary. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you decide to change?" Marco took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "I think I finally realized what kind of person I'd become," he said. "I was angry, bitter, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it, people like you. I thought I was in control, but I was really just hurting myself and everyone around me. I lost sight of what was important." Daniel listened, his face softening just slightly. "And what's important now?" he asked. "Respect," Marco said simply. "Treating people the way they deserve to be treated. Not using my position to push others down, but to lift them up. I want to be better, Daniel. Not just for my job, but for myself, and I want to earn your trust." Daniel was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's hard for me to believe that you've really changed. You were pretty awful back then." Marco nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I don't blame you for feeling that way, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove myself, even if it takes a long time." There was another pause, and then Daniel spoke, his voice quieter. "You know what you did? It really messed me up. I was just a kid, and you made me feel like I was nothing." Marco felt a pang of guilt, his chest tightening. He looked directly at Daniel, his eyes sincere. "I'm truly sorry, Daniel. I can't change what I did, but I want to make it right. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope that maybe, over time, I can show you that I'm different now." Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco nodded. "I understand, and I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I just want a chance to prove that I've changed." Daniel was silent for a moment, then looked back at Marco. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe I can give you that chance." Marco smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." They sat there for a while longer, the tension slowly easing. Marco could see that Daniel was still hesitant, still unsure, but there was also a glimmer of hope. It was a start, and that was more than Marco could have hoped for. After a few minutes, Marco cleared his throat. "Look, I know this might be a bit forward, but would you be willing to grab a coffee sometime? I'd like to keep talking, get to know you better, if you're open to it." Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess. I could do that. Just coffee, though. Don't think this means I trust you yet." Marco nodded, his smile widening slightly. "Of course, I get it. One step at a time." Daniel stood up, and Marco followed suit. They shook hands, and Marco could feel the tension in Daniel's grip, the hesitance still there. But it was a start, and Marco was determined to make the most of it. "Tomorrow, after work," Daniel suggested, his tone casual but guarded. "Sounds good," Marco agreed. "There's a cafe around the corner. I'll meet you there." Daniel nodded, then turned and walked out of the dealership. Marco watched him go, a feeling of cautious hope building inside him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. But for the first time, he felt like he had a real shot at making things right. As Marco returned to his desk, he noticed Steve watching from a distance, a curious expression on his face. Marco gave him a nod but didn't say anything. He wasn't doing this for anyone's approval, but his own, and maybe, just maybe, for Daniel's. Marco arrived at the cafe early. He wanted to be prepared, to make sure he was calm and focused. He picked a table near the window, where they would have a clear view of the street, but also enough privacy to talk. He ordered a coffee and sat down, waiting, his hands fidgeting slightly around the cup. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Marco looked up to see Daniel stepping inside. Marco waved, and Daniel nodded, walking over to the table. Marco stood briefly as a sign of respect before they both sat down. "Thanks for coming," Marco said, trying to keep his voice relaxed but sincere. Daniel nodded, his face still cautious. "Yeah, well, figured it couldn't hurt to hear what you had to say," Daniel replied, sitting back in his chair. The waitress came by, and Daniel ordered a black coffee. They sat in silence for a moment, Marco trying to gather his thoughts. He knew this conversation mattered. "Look," Marco started, "I just want to be open about everything. I know I messed up back then. I was dealing with my own issues, but that's not an excuse for how I treated you. I was wrong." Daniel looked at him, his expression still skeptical. "You've said that before, Marco. I get that you're sorry, but it doesn't really change what happened." Marco nodded. "I know. I can't change the past, but I want to make it right, even if it's just a little." Daniel sighed, taking a sip of his coffee. "Do you even know what it was like? The way you treated me. It made me feel like I was nothing, like I didn't matter." Marco felt his chest tighten, a pang of guilt that seemed to settle deep. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "I'm truly sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't see it back then. I was so wrapped up in my own anger and bitterness that I didn't care about the people I hurt. But I see it now, and I hate that I made you feel that way." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes looking down at the table. "It's not easy to forget," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I carried that with me for a long time." Marco nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. And I don't expect you to just forget it. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I'm here now, and I want to do better. I want to be someone you can trust." Daniel looked up, meeting Marco's gaze. His expression softened, but there was still a hint of doubt there. "You say you've changed, but how do I know it's real? How do I know you won't just go back to the way you were?" Marco took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "I think it's something I have to prove every day," he said slowly. "It's not about making one big gesture and then moving on. It's about the choices I make, every single day, to be better. I know it won't be easy, and I know I'll make mistakes, but I'm committed to trying." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I guess that's all you can do." Marco smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I appreciate you giving me the chance to have this conversation. It means a lot." Daniel shrugged, looking away. "I'm not doing this for you. I guess I want to see if people can really change." "I get that," Marco said. "And I'm going to do everything I can to show you that I have." They sat there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the cafe filling the space around them, the clinking of cups, the low hum of conversation. Marco could feel the weight of everything they had talked about, but he also felt a sense of relief. He had finally been honest, not just with Daniel, but with himself. After a few minutes, Marco cleared his throat. "So, what have you been up to?" he asked, trying to shift the conversation to something lighter. "What are you doing these days?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "Working, mostly. I've been doing some IT stuff. Nothing too exciting." "That's great," Marco said, genuinely interested. "It is a good field. Lots of opportunities." "Yeah, it's all right," Daniel said, his tone still guarded, but there was a hint of openness that hadn't been there before. They talked for a while longer, the tension slowly easing. Marco could see that Daniel was still unsure, still hesitant, but he was willing to engage, to talk. And that was more than Marco could have hoped for. "I think maybe that's a start," Daniel said finally, his voice soft. He looked at Marco, his expression still guarded, but there was a hint of something else, a willingness to let Marco in, even if just a little. Marco smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for giving me a chance." Daniel nodded, then looked down at his coffee. "It's not forgiveness, not yet, but it's something." Marco nodded, his smile widening slightly. "I'll take it. And I'll keep working on it, every day." They finished their coffee, and Daniel stood up, giving Marco a nod. "I guess I'll see you around," he said, his tone still cautious. "Definitely," Marco replied, standing as well. "I'm always here if you need anything." Daniel nodded again, then turned and walked out of the cafe. Marco watched him go, a feeling of cautious hope building inside him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. But for the first time, he felt like he had a real shot at making things right. As Marco walked out of the cafe and headed back to the dealership, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't about making one big gesture. It was about the small, consistent actions he took every day to prove he had changed, and he was ready for it. The next day, Marco stood behind his desk at the dealership, his eyes focused on the entrance. The sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow on the showroom floor. He was nervous, but there was also a sense of calm inside him, a readiness. He had come a long way, and today he hoped to take another important step. It was around noon when Marco saw them, Daniel and his mother. They walked through the entrance together, their expressions serious but not hostile. Marco took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and approached them with a confident but humble smile. "Good afternoon," Marco said, his voice steady. "Thank you both for coming in again." The mother nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Marco. "We're here to see if you really meant what you said," she replied, her tone measured. Marco gestured toward the SUVs, inviting them to follow. "Of course. Please take your time," he said. "I'm here to help in any way I can." The mother and Daniel walked beside Marco as they approached the luxury SUV section. Marco moved slowly, letting them take the lead, ensuring they felt no pressure. He wanted them to see that he was there not to push for a sale, but to assist. The mother stopped beside the SUV they had looked at previously. She ran her hand along the polished exterior, her eyes scanning the car thoughtfully. Daniel stood beside her, watching Marco carefully, his gaze questioning. "This is the one we were interested in," the mother said, glancing at Marco. "You said you've changed, Marco. Today, we're here to see if that's true." Marco nodded, his expression sincere. "I understand. I want to prove it, not just with words, but with actions." The mother looked at him for a moment longer, then opened the driver's side door, peering inside. Marco stood back, giving her space. He noticed Daniel watching him, his expression guarded but less hostile than before. "Go ahead and take a look inside, Mom," Daniel said, then turned to Marco. "Let's see how you handled today, Marco." Marco nodded, acknowledging the challenge. He led them through the features of the SUV again, answering their questions patiently, explaining each aspect in detail. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to fall back into his old ways. But Marco remained calm, focused. He was determined to show them that he was different now. As they moved through the process, Daniel's mother began asking more detailed questions about financing and warranties. Marco took his time, making sure to explain everything thoroughly. He could see the skepticism in her eyes begin to fade, replaced by a hint of something else, maybe trust, or at least the possibility of it. "Marco," the mother said as they neared the end of the discussion, "you've been patient today, but patience isn't the same as real change. How do we know this isn't just an act?" Marco took a deep breath, looking at her directly. "I know it's hard to believe. I know I've done things in the past that make it difficult for you to trust me. But I'm committed to proving, not just to you, but to myself, that I can be better. I'm willing to take it one day at a time, to show that this isn't just an act." Daniel was quiet, his eyes on Marco. He finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "It's going to take time, Marco. You really hurt me back then, and it's not something I can just forget." "I understand," Marco said quietly. "And I don't expect you to forget or forgive me right away. I'm just asking for the chance to show you that I'm different now." There was a long silence, the tension thick in the air. Marco could feel his heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The mother finally nodded, her expression softening slightly. "All right," she said. "We'll take the SUV. But know this, Marco, you're not off the hook. We'll be watching, and we expect you to prove yourself every day." Marco smiled, his heart swelling with relief. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I promise I won't let you down." They moved back to Marco's desk, where they began the paperwork. Marco remained patient, explaining each step clearly, ensuring they understood everything. He wanted them to feel comfortable, to know that this was about more than just a transaction. It was about building a new foundation of trust. As they finished up, Marco handed the keys to the mother, his eyes meeting hers. "I know this is just the beginning," he said, "but I want you to know how much I appreciate the chance you're giving me." The mother nodded, her face serious but not unkind. "We'll see, Marco," she said. "Actions speak louder than words." Daniel looked at Marco, his expression still cautious but softer. "Just keep doing what you're doing," he said. "Maybe, eventually, we can move past all of this." Marco nodded, his voice steady. "I will, one day at a time." They stood up, and Marco walked them to the door. He watched as the mother opened the driver's door, pausing for a moment before she looked back at Marco. "Good luck," she said simply. Marco smiled. "Thank you. I'll need it." Daniel gave Marco a small nod before climbing into the passenger seat. Marco stood by the entrance, watching as they drove away. He felt a sense of closure, but also a realization that this was just the beginning. He had taken the first steps, but there was still a long road ahead, one that would require continuous effort, humility, and patience. Marco returned to the showroom, the dealership bustling with activity. He walked back to his desk, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about selling cars anymore. It was about redemption, about proving to Daniel, his mother, and most importantly, to himself, that he could be the person he wanted to be. Steve approached Marco, a curious look on his face. "Did they end up buying the SUV?" he asked. Marco nodded. "Yeah, they did," he replied, his smile genuine but understated. Steve raised an eyebrow. "Wow, after everything? I didn't think they'd come back." Marco shrugged, his smile widening slightly. "I guess people can surprise you," he said. Steve nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Maybe. I hope it works out for you, Marco." "Really?" "Thanks, Steve," Marco said. "I appreciate that." Steve walked away, and Marco sat down at his desk, taking a deep breath. He knew he still had a lot of work to do, both at the dealership and on himself. He wasn't looking for an easy path, and he wasn't expecting everything to fall into place overnight, but he was ready to face each day with a renewed commitment, ready to prove that change was possible. Marco looked out at the showroom, the sunlight streaming in through the glass, and he smiled. It was a new day, and he was ready to face it, one moment at a time.